Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Larry Eichel of the Pew Charitable Trusts to discuss their latest policy brief, how future employment patterns could put Philadelphia's operating budget at risk. In the second half of the show, we'll discuss the recent property reassessments and where we stand on the budget. I'm Larry McGlynn, and I am joined here by our consumer reporter, Lance Haver. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right, enjoying the beginning of summer.
It's been very hot the last 2 days. I do not do well in the hot weather.
Oh,
And I'm sitting here in my home office that does not have air conditioning, and I don't know if you can tell, but I'm sweating profusely.
you look
It's
great. For
that
me, the start of summer since I've come to Philadelphia in 1978 is the Kite Festival in Wildwood.
oh, okay.
They
All
have an
right.
annual kite festival that only unique people attend.
Okay.
And
Well, I didn't know about it, but now that I do,
well, just to let
um,
you know, there is an event called kite fighting, so you can still have a combative sport even when it comes to flying kites.
okay. Well, that's good. I'm gonna have to look into that. The first thing we're going to do is share our interview we did with Larry Eichel of the Pew Charitable Trusts to talk about the city budget and what could be happening in the next few years that could be problematic. So here's our interview with Larry Eichel. Mr. Eichel, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be with you again.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the series of briefs that you've been producing with Pew?
Sure. We've put out 3 briefs so far in a series that we're referring to as Philadelphia's Fiscal Future. And we've done this in sort of partnership with the eConsult Solutions, Inc., which is an economic consulting firm in the city. And they sort of have designed some of the work and done the research. We've sort of been in charge of the presentation and deciding sort of how to frame this and how to present it. So the first of the 3 looked at the impact that the pandemic has had on the city's economy, in terms of primarily in terms of jobs, but kind of looking at how hard the city was hit, the fact that it was hit harder than the nation as a whole, although sort of in keeping with other cities in the northeastern part of the country. That was really the first piece. In the second piece, we put together 4 scenarios that would sort of describe the city's economic development, the way the city's economy would develop from now until 2026. And we framed those scenarios in terms of the total of number of jobs located in the city. And we saw sort of from the best case to the worst case, different of about 10% or 70,000 jobs. So roughly 705,000 jobs in the worst case scenario, 775,000 in the best case scenario. And looked at the details of sort of what sectors of the economy those jobs might be in terms of the type of industries, and also of jobs in terms of wages they would pay. And then this third piece, which is the most recent one, looks at sort of the impact those 4 scenarios. And again, the scenarios are not predictions. They're really just a framework for looking at possibilities. So what do those different scenarios mean for the city's revenues, for its ability to raise money to do the things that city government wants to do? And this was all assuming that the tax structure was not going to change. And obviously it may change some in the next month, but probably won't change that March. So that's the assumption. And we found that over the five fiscal years that we're looking at, you're looking at a gap from the best case to the worst case of almost $1.6 billion cumulatively, with the amount of that gap increasing as time goes on. So it's over 500 million in the last of the 5 years, but 1.6 billion cumulatively. And to put that in perspective, that's about 7 or 8% of what the city raises, or raised sort of going into this, raised last year, say. So, you know, it's not the end of the world, but it's a significant amount of money. And one of the points we make in this brief that important is we're not going to, you know, the sky is not going to fall, and it's not going to fall soon for sure, because the city has all this money from the American Rescue Plan, the federal government's COVID intervention plan that passed in March of 2021. And one of the uses that money can be put to is what's called revenue replacement, which basically is, you know, replacing the money that you would have had it not been for the changes that have occurred as a result of COVID. And the city has indicated it's going to use all of that money for that purpose. And that will certainly cushion the city budget for the next several years. But eventually that money runs out, you know, and then there'll be some big questions.
And that sort of brings you perfectly to the next thing I wanted to ask you about. Now, the federal funds are about $1.4 billion received from the federal government. That's going to replace about $1.5 billion in lost revenue over the course of 5 years. Those funds have to be allocated by the end of 2024 and completely spent down by 2026, I believe.
That's right.
So, you know, we're looking at the city to use that money to fill their revenue gaps. What concerns you about the city budget after those federal funds are drawn down?
Well, I mean, there's certainly going to have to be, in the latter years, there's going to have to be an awareness among city officials that this money is disappearing, and that adjustments are going to have to be made, so that, you know, there's kind of a glide path to whatever the new reality is, and not a cliff at the end. And you know, we'll see what happens. Obviously, they'll think about that. I mean, a lot of cities, a lot of big cities, are using their dollars in a similar fashion to the way Philadelphia is. They're using all or most of their money to sort of patch over their budgets, and obviously that's a permissible use under the federal law. I mean, there are some places that are kind of doing better economically, where they're using the money for special projects, maybe focusing projects directed at some of the people who got hit the hardest by the COVID shutdown and the aftermath, and other sort of structure change, you know, one-time kind of changes, projects that they want to do. But as I say, a lot of the big cities are not doing that. They're using primarily to sort of just keep things going.
And a couple of the important factors here too. The report mentions that wage tax loss between now and the end of that period of funding is going to be about 572 million.
Yeah, and to understand that figure, that's an estimate of how much less the city would get over this period from the non-resident wage tax than it would have had nothing changed. I mean, it's not, you know, there won't be a line anywhere on a budget of minus 572, because it's projecting against what would have happened, right? So, but obviously that's still a significant amount of money, and one of the things that we say in the report is it might be more than that. This is really hard to get a handle on. I think it's hard for city officials to get a handle on it, because some of the money they're not getting is people not paying the money in the first place, and some of it is refunds that people file afterwards. And it has to do with sort of the complexity of the non-resident wage tax. The non-resident wage tax obviously applies to non-residents who work in the city. They pay, I think it's 3.44 something percent at the moment, slightly less than what residents pay. But when their office, during the height of the pandemic, when their offices were closed, they did not pay the wage tax because they could not come into the city to work. Now, if they work from home of their own volition, if it's their choice, they're supposed to pay the wage tax. It's hard to know how many people are actually complying with that. I think it's a very hard thing to enforce. And one of the unknowns here is, a lot of people have gotten used to working from home. And if you do that, particularly as a suburbanite attached to a job based in the city, obviously you save the cost of commuting, you save the time that you'd spend commuting. The rest of your life is at hand and is easier to get to. And maybe you haven't been paying the wage tax. So if the time comes when the employer says you have to come back to work in the city, or at least you have to come back and work in the city some of the time, as that's starting to happen for a lot of people, they may resist. And, the employer presumably wants to keep his employees happy. And turnover at an organization is not the best thing. It's time consuming. It involves all sorts of. So one thinks that some employers will try to find a way to accommodate those suburban employees in such a way that they legally do not have to pay the wage tax. And perhaps the business could set up a small office in the suburbs to which those jobs would be officially attached. And there are probably other ways to do it as well. So as time goes on, we may see an erosion of the wage tax beyond what is already projected. And it's hard to know, but that's a risk.
And the wage tax is the largest portion of the revenue for the budget, as of now, anyway.
Yeah, it's roughly half, maybe a little less, of the locally generated revenue. I mean, the city obviously gets aid from the state and the federal government. There are other sources of money, but of locally generated tax revenues, the wage tax is much the largest. There's in the city's 5-year plan, it says that non-resident wage taxes account for somewhere between 13 and 14% of all local taxes. So, I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, significant. So what happens if we start to see this shift? What happens to lower income people in Philadelphia residents?
Well, if there's less money being paid if suburbanites are paying less than freight, stands to reason that city residents are going to pay more, just going to make up the difference. And that'll be true even if tax rates don't go up. It will have an impact on low-income residents, and there are some studies out there that already show that local taxes, state and local taxes in this particular study, are higher on a percentage basis on low-income residents in Philadelphia than in most other cities in the country, so that's that's likely to happen. And it's not just the wage tax. I mean, presumably you'll see reductions in other taxes that we're seeing already, reductions in other taxes that are often paid by suburbanites, such as the parking tax. If fewer suburbanites are driving in to come to work, they're paying less in that tax. So the proportion of the overall taxes paid by city residents is likely to go up over time, and obviously a lot of city residents are low income, and we're certainly seeing that, seeing some of that conversation right now before City Council in the conversation about what to do about the property tax, because the new assessments came out. They've gone up quite a bit, and especially on the residential level, and in some low-income neighborhoods, particularly high increases in percentage terms. And one of the ways to deal with that that City Council is considering is to increase the so-called homestead exemption even more than the administration has been proposing. And the homestead exemption basically excludes some of the value of your house, makes some of the value of your house non-taxable if you live in, if it's owner occupied, if you own the house you're living. And one of the proposals before the council right now is to increase the homestead exemption from its current level of 45,000 to 90,000, which is there are all sorts of complicated state formulas. That's as high as it can go. And that would obviously have a big impact on the property taxes of lower income people, because presumably a lot of the homes they own, some of them may be worth less than 90,000 and they won't pay any property tax. But even if they have a house that's worth 125,000 or 150,000, that'll have a big increase. I mean, it's the same, the way the homestead exemptions work, it's the same dollar amount for everybody, whether your home is worth $50,000 or $1 million. But obviously in percentage terms, that's a much bigger deal for a low income person in a relatively low value house than for a high income person in a high value house.
And that's one of the key issues we're following right now. There's going to be, I think, all kinds of proposals put forth, already have been, about the assessments. And when you put that on top of what we're talking about now with the wage tax, and already there are wage tax cuts in process, it's unclear as to what's exactly going to happen, but there's all kinds of elements here that have to be closely watched. I just wanted to go back to the office space issue really quick.
Sure.
One of the items in the report mentioned that across the country there was a survey taken, and Philadelphia wasn't included, but it stands to reason Philadelphia would be reflective of these numbers. That office space usage is going to decline by between 12 and 25% in big cities, and that could lead in Philadelphia and elsewhere to further property tax declines. Have you heard anything or seen any literature that suggests there are ways that this can be avoided?
Well, it's interesting that in the new reassessment in the city, commercial property as a group only went up 9%, while as residential went up by several times that amount, which suggests that to some degree it may have been it's somewhat being taken into account already. But I would expect we'll see a lot of appeals of the current, of those assessments, even based on the experience that the owners of office buildings are seeing. I mean, obviously we don't know how long this remote work is going to continue, but it feels, it's starting to feel like it's a lifestyle change as well as a sort of public safety concern. And to the degree that it does, owners of large office buildings are going to argue that their buildings aren't worth as much as they were. Now, these spaces, presumably some of them ultimately can be and will be put to other uses. The most obvious, the one that comes to mind for everybody first is to convert them to residential. And we've certainly seen some office buildings in Center City already converted to residential. It's the jury's still out on how much of that is reasonable to expect. I mean, obviously, one is the question of demand. I mean, whether there's obviously a tremendous amount of residential construction going on in the city now. Is there demand for all of that plus some more by converting office buildings? And the other is that a lot of modern office buildings aren't that easy to convert to residential use. I think of the building where my offices were at Pew, and the core of that building, the sort of central area, is windowless, and a lot of buildings are built that way now, and it's not obvious to see how that would be could be converted. I'm sure it could be, but it's just a question of how expensive it would be, and whether the market would justify that. But that's certainly a possibility, and certainly something we're going to be seeing more of as time goes on.
So when we look at all the information that you've given us and covered in these briefings, and when we look at the current budget hearings we're talking about in the city, property reassessments, do you see any opportunities for taxation and budgetary issues and things like that to be more equitable for the citizens of Philadelphia?
Yeah, I mean that's really tough, and it's interesting what's happening now. I mean, both basically all of the taxes that the city has. The city basically has four types of taxes. It has direct taxes on business. It has consumption taxes, which is sales tax, the beverage tax, parking, and amusement. It has the wage tax, and it has property tax. And now, obviously, the business taxes don't affect people directly, but the consumption, wage, and property tax all hit everybody across the board. And the wage tax is a flat tax, so it means you pay the same percentage if you're making $25,000 or making $250,000. Although there is a tax credit program that can help you get some of that money back, but it's complicated. It involves filing a state form and filing another form off of that, and a lot of people aren't aware of it, and the pickup on it is very small, and so it's interesting how council is obviously very concerned about these equity issues, and it appears to be leaning toward working more on the property tax side of it than on the wage tax side. I mean, there's not much you can do about the consumption taxes, but obviously you have control over the wage tax rate and property tax system. And, the way they seem to be headed is the way to make the system fairer is with the homestead exemption and some other programs that would really reduce the property tax liability of low-income homeowners, and presumably for renters would be passed along to them, at least in lesser rent increases over time. They seem to be more focused on that piece of it than of, say, reducing the wage tax rate, which would also help people with lower income. It's a tough choice, but that's where they seem to be headed.
Can you give us a preview of part 4 of the series?
Yeah, part 4, which is coming out in a month more or less, kind of really looks more at kind of what we don't know. What we've learned and what we still don't know. What are the questions that we're going to see answered as time goes on? And it comes back to sort of a lot of the same themes. I mean, obviously it's so much about jobs, and it's all kind of very complicated now with whereas now that a lot of businesses, you don't have to live in the same city where the job is. I mean, that makes the way you think about jobs and their relation to the city's future, that changes all of that. And and complicating that it is what seems like a labor shortage that in some areas anyway, seemingly a lot of sectors, a lot of jobs, a lot of places of business, employers are having trouble finding people to work and keeping people work. And certainly some of this is because some people, it appears that there was a rash of early retirements and of people sort of dropping out of the workforce entirely for various reasons that occurred during the pandemic, and that factor has now created sort of has put workers more in the driver's seat on a lot of things, and so people may be less willing to take the jobs that they would have taken before. The nature of the job, the conditions of the job, the amount of the pay for it. They don't want to do that anymore, and because of the market, they can probably find something else. They can find something better, something that be more fulfilling for them, that may feel more like the beginning of a career, and so on. So all of these are factors that we don't know where they're going. So what I hope Fiscal Future for is an intelligent discussion of what we don't know, and the factors that are really going to determine how things play out in the next few years.
Well, we'll be looking forward to that, and hopefully when it comes out, maybe you can come back and talk to us about it.
I would be happy to.
Okay, we'd like to thank Larry Eichel for being with us. And if you want to read more of Pew's work, you can find them at pewtrust.org, projects/Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative. Lance, any takeaways from that?
Well, again, always a great job by Larry Eichel. It's always wonderful to listen to him, and the in-depth reporting and the analysis. The one thing I was a little surprised didn't come up was a change in the tax laws that doesn't allow workers who are coming from the suburbs who work in the city to write off that wage tax. One of the things that the Trump administration did was really punish the suburban Philadelphians by saying no longer can you use the wage tax, the non-resident wage tax you pay, as a way of lowering your federal taxes. And it's just always surprising that doesn't come up more often, and always surprising that the Republicans in the suburbs don't seem to mind paying more taxes so that the city of Philadelphia has to collect more.
And we'd like to bring on Denise Clay Murray.
Hi.
Hey, Denise, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
It's good to see you.
And,
So,
I was just gonna, kind of piggyback on what Lance said about how the folks in the suburbs aren't, demanding this piece of money back in terms of the wage tax. And part of the reason why they might not be doing it is because of the optics. Anything to make Philadelphia look like this place you don't want to live in, they're going to try it. It's what they do.
Yeah.
So, if you're able to say, see, if you live there, you're going to have to, they're taking your money to, give to those people. It's a good selling point for them.
I'm sure you're right, but it's one of those cases where we're paying taxes on money we're not getting. So the federal government taxes us, and then we pay a wage tax we're not getting. And it used to be in the old days, there was an attempt to be fair and just and say, we're not going to tax you on money you don't actually get. And now we've basically said, the federal government's basically said, we don't care. We're just going to tax you as much as we possibly can and redo the tax code so that the very wealthy get all the benefits, and the working people and the people who are upper middle class, the people who suffered the most as a result of the Trump tax cuts, the people who paid the highest price were really the upper middle class, the doctors, lawyers, accountants, college professors. They're the ones who ended up paying much more because they can't get the tax deductions for the state taxes or the city taxes. They can't write off their property taxes, and they're the ones who end up with a much higher tax bill. The super wealthy, of course, get the benefits, and the people who are desperately poor aren't paying taxes because they don't have any income. So it's just a curiosity why you would want to go after the accountants, lawyers, doctors, nurses, the professional class.
Well, as someone who has to deal with more than her share of doctors, there are some doctors I wish they would go after a little bit more.
Just take their second votes away from them. We should have a law, one per doctor is enough.
And see,
one yacht
enough. But that's what kills me about the whole cancel student debt debate. If you're having that discussion with me from the front seat of your Lexus in your Gucci outfit and your Louis Vuitton, you're holding your Louis Vuitton bag, I'm really not trying to have that discussion with you because the bag is $3,200 and the outfit is at least $2,500, and we're not even going to get into the cost of the car. You can afford to pay your student loans.
Right. When I worked for the city, some of the saddest stories I heard were from young African Americans who were basically persuaded to go to some of these for-profit colleges, and the college would make arrangements for all the loans. And at the end of the day, the degree was worthless or they didn't finish. And they were really prevented from entering a middle-class life because they had all this student debt. Unlike people who went to different schools where the graduation led to an employment opportunity, the Art Institute and all of these other places that are now out of business didn't end up with any opportunities. And so there is this segment of people who, I don't want to say tricked because that's probably the wrong word, but people who...
Tricked is exactly the right word.
Well,
because I saw it up close. An ex-boyfriend of mine ended up going to one of these computer schools.
Right.
And he got nothing out of it.
And we should find a way to eliminate his debt. The thing the federal government set up, even under President Obama, and then it got worse under President Trump, was so cumbersome and so difficult that it was almost impossible for people to get those bad debts set aside. And there are all these stories of all these colleges that filed bankruptcies and didn't discharge the student loans because they had sold the student loans to somebody else. So there, I certainly there are a number of people who are doing very well that have student debt, but the majority of people who are really struggling, I think, are people who are not doing that well. But that should be another show. We should have people come on and talk about student debt, and hopefully we can get a couple of experts. And I know there's some people in our community who want to talk about it, and I know it's a significant issue for those people. You'll say tricked, I'll say persuaded. People, because we tell everyone the best thing you can do is get an education. The people who listen to us sometimes don't have the skill set to know what's a real education and what's a money-making opportunity for the person who runs the trade school. And
particularly if they're first generation college students, they don't have any frame of reference, and that's a lot of who these people are who do get pulled into these things because they just see college and they don't know about accreditation, things like that, and it's it's a scam.
Right. The only distinction I'm trying to make is we as a society ask people to do that. We say, please go further your education. Do whatever you can to invest in yourself and get an education. So they're really doing the honorable thing. They're really trying to do what people tell them to do so that they can live a middle-class life. And then when it turns out that they were swindled by the school, society doesn't do anything to help them. So we lay the groundwork, we build the garden path, we walk them down it, and then when it turns out to be a nightmare, we say, oh, well, freedom of choice, you didn't have to pick that college.
Right.
And you ever notice how because when my ex was going to this computer school, most places, like even for community college, you got to fill out a FAFSA form, which gives you other ways to pay for college, like Pell Grants. Granted, you got to be dirt poor for a Pell Grant these days, but you at least have that as an option. You also have work study as an option. Again, you got to be dirt poor, but it's there. These particular schools go in with the sole and intent purpose of you having to take out not just a loan, but a large loan.
Yep, that's right.
Sounds like we should get some people on to talk about it. So
yeah,
the tax assessments, Larry, I know you had a presentation you wanted us to look at.
Yeah, so what I just want to start off by talking about, and we're going to keep talking about this for the foreseeable future, because this isn't an issue that's going away, and it's certainly not going to go away over the summer and into next fall when appeals are going to be due. Although I think the appeal deadline may be pushed back, we're still going to be talking about this, and we're going to be covering this in our newsletter as well and on the show. And I think we're going to have some more guests in the near future who are going to tell us more about this as time goes on. But what I wanted to reiterate a little bit here, just some of the legislation that City Council has put forth in just the last few weeks to help soften the blow of these assessments. Now, legislation theoretically would have been introduced already for it to be passed by the end of the term, by the end of this spring session. The last City Council meeting, I believe, is June 23rd. And the way it works is if legislation is presented, it has to go to a committee hearing and be approved out of committee and then be heard at 2 subsequent City Council meetings. So we're probably past that point now. So I don't think anything new will be introduced that could be passed before the end of the term. So I just want to put that out there right now. The legislation we're going to talk about and run through right here could theoretically be passed before the end of the term. Although I took a look at the calendar today and I haven't seen hearings scheduled for any of these yet. It doesn't mean it won't happen. It just means it hasn't happened yet. I just want to tell you a couple of things here. So City Council President Clark introduced some legislation. It was introduced on his behalf because the City Council President cannot introduce legislation. So Majority Leader Parker introduced this for him. But a piece of legislation that would use the eligibility for the Commonwealth's PACE-Net program, which is the pharmaceutical assistance for elderly needs enhancement tier as a measurement for eligibility for low-income taxpayers who would be entitled to a refund or forgiveness of their real estate tax liability due to the reassessment. And the Revenue Department would then make this program known, and the Tax Review Board would review appeals. So that's as much as we know about it right now. I think specifics are going to be worked out, but that would be that's something that Council President Clark has introduced for older citizens. He also introduced a bill that would raise the homestead exemption from $45,000 to $65,000. So just to refresh on what the homestead exemption is, if your home value is, let's say, $100,000, the current homestead exemption is $45,000. So you would take $100,000 minus $45,000, and that $55,000 number would be the amount of taxes you would pay. So it's just basically taking like the $45,000 off the value of your home and just paying taxes on what remains. Okay. But Councilmember O'Neill introduced his own bill that would take the homestead exemption up to $90,000, which is the most allowed by law. And the way this works is you're allowed to do a homestead exemption for the median house price in the city or in any municipality. In Philadelphia, it's about $180,000. So the $90,000 exemption takes it right to that number. So Councilmember O'Neill introduced that a couple weeks ago. And he also introduced legislation that would extend the 2022 senior citizen tax freeze application deadline to to September 30th. So the deadline is passed, but it would give you more time to apply for it if you hadn't already. And just to give you an idea of what the requirements are for the senior citizen tax freeze, you have to be 65 years of age or older. You have to live in the same household with a spouse who's age 65 years or older, or a person age 50 years or older who is a widow of someone who reached the age of 65 before passing away. If you meet those requirements, one of those requirements, then you have to also meet the following. For a single person, your income has to be $33,500 or less, or for a married couple, $41,500 or less. All right. And this is all information I believe we had this on our newsletter already, but we're going to put it back in again this week. So you'll have all these things right at your fingertips to consider. And we'll also have instructions and links to how to apply to these programs. We'll make sure everybody has that. Councilmember Kenyatta Johnson introduced a package of legislation, including a bill requiring the Office of Property Assessment to disclose the certification data 10 days after submission to the Commonwealth. He included a bill modifying the parameters and deadline of the senior citizen tax freeze, basically making taxpayers who have qualified for this in the past, and they had done it in a timely fashion, to qualify for it this year, to automatically be enrolled. And he also introduced changes to the LOOP program, the Long-Time Owner Occupant Program. So currently, properties that experienced a 50% or greater increase in their assessment from 1 year to the next, or a 75% increase over a 5-year period, and the household meets certain income thresholds, the owner is eligible for tax relief. Johnson's bill would allow for the exemption to continue for properties that began receiving the exemptions prior to 2023. So if your household income is less than or equal to 150% of the area median income, you would continue. And then Councilmember David O introduced a couple of programs, a couple of bills. One, and this is pretty interesting, I think, and something that we've been talking about on this show, and has come up, I think, with everybody we've spoken to about the reassessments, the methodology for creating these assessments. So Councilmember O would want that information to be made public by May 1st of the year the reassessments are undertaken. So all that information would be available to people. And it's interesting because one of the questions that we've been asking people is if that information isn't made public and you received a significant increase in your assessment, or an increase at all for that matter, and you wanted to challenge it, you wouldn't have the criteria by which your assessment was created. So I think it would make it difficult to challenge. So this legislation would show you exactly how it was done. And this is also interesting. Councilmember O introduced a potential charter change. He had also put this forth in 2018 and didn't go anywhere. But this would allow City Council to obtain a preliminary review and independent audit of assessments if they increase by more than twice the rate of the Consumer Price Index. So if that's the case, and the audit that City Council commissions determines that the assessments were below industry standard or less accurate than the previous year, City Council could reject that assessment. So basically, if the assessments go up by more than, let's say, 8 or 9% in a given year, which I believe is the Consumer Price Index percentage that he referenced, then you could come back and say, well, if these assessments aren't as accurate as they used to be, we're not even going to accept them. I think it's an interesting idea. I think there are going to be significant challenges to that. But it was something that I think was interesting. So what can you do right now if you're a citizen of Philadelphia and you're dealing with these property assessments? So if I can share my screen here, I want to show you my slides. There we go. Okay. So here are some of the programs that we've been talking about. The first one is the Long-Time Owner Occupant Program. This is a relief program for homeowners whose assessments have increased significantly if they meet certain requirements. Your home's assessment increased by 50% or more since last year. If you lived in your home for 10 years or more, your property taxes are paid and you're an owner-occupied payment agreement or installment plan, and your income is below the minimum for your family size. So that is the Loop program. There are about 15,000 people in the city in it right now. It appears that there's at least some movement in City Council to make this program a little more accessible, and we're going to be following that very closely and make sure people know about that as it comes. But right now, if you're looking at this and seeing that you match those criteria, we're going to show you how to apply for it. Next is the homestead exemption. We've already talked about this. Right now, this reduces your the taxable value of your primary residence by $45,000. There's no age or income requirements, and this is the most accessible and most powerful tool right now for real estate tax relief. Most homeowners save an average of $629 annually. Once you're approved, you do not have to renew. It just stays there. And you need to apply by September 13th to see if the new value is reflected on next year's tax bill. So homestead exemption, if you don't have this, this is the thing you could probably do right now that could save yourself that percentage on your tax bill. The senior citizen tax freeze, we've already talked a little bit about this. Freezes real estate taxes if you meet certain age and income requirements. You're 65 years old or older. You live in the same household with a spouse who is 65 plus. You're 50 plus and widow of someone who reached the age of 65 before passing away. And the income requirements for a single person, $33,500 or less. And for a married couple, $41,500 or less. Okay. Now what I want to show you is how to find your property assessment. So these are not going to be mailed out in the next month or so, as far as we know. And there are a couple reasons for that. One of which being an apparent envelope shortage. So what you can do, and I'll show you this real quick. This is just, I use City Hall as the example here. This is what it would look like when you find it. And how do you do it? Well, what I want to do here is just bring this up if I can. Okay, I can't do it for some reason. All right. So you would go to phila.gov/programs. Oh wait, I'm on the wrong slide. Excuse me. You go to property.phila.gov. Okay, and this is what comes up, and you put your address in up here, and it'll take you to your property. It'll show you the assessed value, okay, and then some other information. And then if you scroll down, and I can't do that right here for some reason, I couldn't open the web page, but it'll show you what your assessment is and what it would look like if you had a $45,000 homestead, a $65,000 homestead, or I think at this point even they're putting the 90,000 on there, but they definitely did 45,000 and 65,000. So what that would look like in terms of property tax relief and what your bill would be. It'll show you all that information. Before it didn't really do that, but now it does. Okay, so all that information is there, and it's that's the best. That's one of the best things you can do right now is find that information, see if you have the homestead exemption on your property. We'll tell you that. If you don't, send in the application for it because that's the lowest hanging fruit here. The other thing you can do right now, and we're going to put this in the newsletter because if the first link I had didn't work, the second one's not going to work. The other best thing you can do right now is find your local registered community organization. These are like local civic groups, and they're all very concerned about this right now. And if you want to get more information, you want to be able to help, but just know what's going on, find your RCO. And the way you do this, and we're going to have this in our newsletter, we'll have an easy way for you to do this in the newsletter. But right now, if you go to phila.gov, and you can go to /programs, register community organizations, and there'll be a list. And you can also go to the Philadelphia map page and put in your address, and it'll show you the boundaries of the RCOs and which one is yours, and it'll give you the contact information. So my recommendation right now is look at your assessment, see if you have the homestead. If you don't, get it. And then contact your RCO to see what they're doing, because they're going to be lobbying council. They're going to be talking to council, and there's going to be a lot more information about this to come. So those are some of the things you can do right now. And again, we're going to have this in our newsletter, and we're going to keep talking about this as the weeks go on.
Excuse me, Larry. I have a question regarding the homestead extension, and I don't know if you would notice or not, but you said that once you're approved for it, you don't have to apply for it again. Is it the house that stays approved or the person that stays approved? Because if you decide to sell your house, does when you sell your house, does that automatically come with the homestead exception?
Good question. When we bought our, and this is anecdotal, this is just what we did. I know when we bought our house, we had to apply for it. So I don't know.
It's the person. It has to be owner occupied. And unfortunately, when someone buys a house, the realtor right now isn't allowed to enroll you. It's one of those things where everyone's entitled to it. The city says they want everyone to get it, but the city doesn't make it easy for everyone to get it. The city estimates that there's 385,000 owner-occupied houses. It would be absolutely easy for them to put every one of those houses in the program and then to back people out if they find out they're not owner-occupied. Instead, they take the position that someone has to affirmatively know about it, has to affirmatively know where to apply for it, and then has to apply for it. The only saving grace, to be honest, is you don't have to do it every year.
And we asked Revenue about that. Would they automatically enroll people? And the answer was they didn't think they could do that. But, when you look at it, there's a lot more people who would get it, who needed it, than wouldn't need it. And you could work that out later by automatically enrolling everybody. And I don't think it'd be incredibly difficult to do that. But
the easy example is Macy's knows that people will shoplift. That doesn't mean they close their doors and say no one can shop here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So those are some of the programs. We've been getting more questions and information, questions and comments about this than anything else I think we've ever covered here. And we're grateful for that. And if people have questions, please let us know, because we're going to be having members of the administration, people from CLS, council members on to talk about these things, and we'll ask them and we'll try to get answers for you. One thing that I want to keep asking, and we haven't heard any movement about this yet, is there any movement right now to lower the tax rate? that would help mitigate the costs a lot if they were able to do that. And then, Lance, you've told us that every other municipality in the Commonwealth does this to make sure there isn't a property tax increase.
So unfortunately, it's very confusing. There's two parts to our real estate tax bill. One is the assessment, which is how much they say our homes are worth, minus the deduction, the homestead deduction. And then you multiply that times what they call the millage rate, the percentage of what they tax on, which is approximately 1.4%. So if they wanted to keep the taxes where they are, they could increase the assessments, which is what they're planning on doing, and then lower the tax rate to, let's say, 1.2. That's what every other county in the state does. In Philadelphia, what happens is when they increase the assessment, it's a windfall tax increase for the mayor, whoever's in office, whether it's Mayor Kenny or Mayor Nutter, it doesn't matter. And the council's left to fight over that tax rate. Now, the tax rate hasn't been set yet, and that will probably be set in private negotiations between a few council leaders and the mayor, as all of these things are. But people who are concerned, who don't want to be forced out, people who are concerned with a response to the historic racism that has forced people of color out, may want to say it's not equitable to treat everybody the same. It might seem fair, but some people have borne a bigger burden than others. And maybe when we set these tax rates, we want to try and make amends. I know in California now, people are talking about reparations. We as a city may not be there, but we certainly say, the administration says, that they're all about racial justice. But somehow applying the 31% increase across the board doesn't recognize people of color have struggled and suffered to keep their homes in ways that people that look like me have not.
And one thing that everybody should keep an eye on as we go through this process, particularly with assessments, is what's happening in terms of the state budget. They're sitting on billions of dollars in American Recovery Plan funds and a surplus on top of that. It'll be interesting to see how much of that actually goes to municipalities. And if so, what will we do with it? Because Philadelphia apparently has a pretty nice surplus too, that in terms of American Rescue Plan funds. And while it's looking like it's going to have to be a choice between wage tax cuts, making sure people aren't assessed out of their homes, and anti-violence money to kind of like take care of the city's gun violence rate, people really need to make sure that it doesn't become an either or choice, because there's enough money for both and this time around.
Right.
There is. Go ahead, Lance. I'm sorry.
I think it's an excellent point. You know, people talk about a rainy day fund, but if you're someone who's been exposed to gun violence, it's not just raining, it's pouring. If you're someone who's being forced out of your house, it's not just raining, it's pouring. Who exactly are you saving the money for? We know that people are hurting. We know that people are struggling. We know there's a tremendous need. And somehow the goal is to save it for some day when there'll be a need.
Yeah. And it's, you know, I wouldn't count on any of that state money. You know, I don't think you can with the nature of what goes on in Harrisburg.
Well, no, you probably can't, but you can force the city to take its surplus pot and think about the monsoon that we're in now instead of the rainstorm you might get later.
Right. And that's a question we've been asking since the very beginning when these funds were distributed. You know, what are we going to do with them? And the city has told us, you know, we're concerned about deficits. We're going to fill budget holes. And there are a lot of questions about that. With that, we want to thank Larry Eichel for being with us. Larry Eichel of the Pew Charitable Trust. Please go look at their reports and their briefings that they put out. It's all very, very important information. And we'll be lucky to have him with us again in July to talk about the last part of that briefing. Next week, we'll have Mark Zecca, a former deputy city solicitor. And this is very interesting. We're going to discuss the Atwater Kent collection being moved to Drexel University and the ramifications of that. So Lance and Denise, thank you both so much, and we'll see you next week on Hall Monitor.
Thank you.
Thank you.